Hey everyone, so I got a lot of good feedback on the video from last week, so I figured I'd do another video update this week and not just talk a little bit about of course, kind of what we've been building and kind of what things have been updated, but also talk a little bit more about the theory and kind of the UX side of this. I've talked about it a little bit on the posts and Substack, but I thought it might be a little bit better to use the video to kind of review that and review exactly why we're kind of building this in this way, so that we are able to kind of articulate some of those things. So you can see that I've kind of been fleshing out some component ideas, different button states, different links and adding things, different card designs. So this should be somewhat familiar, I think, from some of the updates that I've made in the past and some of the designs there. We got some bugs here where we kind of have some weird wrapping going on. So we gotta work out some details here. But for the most part, it's coming together pretty well. Certainly it's coming together well enough to be able to test. And in fact, tomorrow and Friday, I'm going to be testing with a couple clinicians, putting this in front of them and seeing, not necessarily this page, but putting kind of some of the other pages in front of them and saying, okay, walk through this and let's try it out and see how it goes. One of the things I've been experimenting a lot with, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I've been experimenting a lot with kind of how some different transition effects happen. One of the things that I think is really important to articulate here is that, transitions and kind of the nitty gritty of how things move and things like that can be a little bit perhaps less important in the grand scheme of getting this thing running, but it can also be really vital to how someone perceives the interface to work. If this kind of general, I think last week when I made the video, this thing was kind of going boop, boop, just kind of real jerky kind of movement. Whereas now it's kind of more of a gentle opening and sliding motion. That kind of stuff can have a really big impact on how someone perceives the interface to react to their actions and the things that they are doing. And so because of that, I've been experimenting with this. In Vue, it's pretty easy to add these things. So it's one of those things that I've just kind of been adding as we go along. But I'm going to get more into kind of what I've built over the last week or so in a minute. I want to talk more about kind of the theory of HealthcareOS in general. And to do that, I want to use this illustration to talk about that and articulate it. But even before I talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about why I think this is necessary. One of the things that I've done and kind of researched and learned about is that, in our primary kind of focus here is primary care physicians. And the reason for that is not just that there are more private primary care physicians in the United States than most other specialties. It's also not just because, primary care is honestly like kind of the front line in a lot of ways to our healthcare system in terms of, primary care or urgent care, things like that. More people see primary care physicians every year than any other specialty. But it's also because in primary care, one of the challenges with EHRs specifically is that there are no standardized workflows for primary care physicians. In fact, on a single day, a primary care physician probably won't use the same workflow or the same set of tasks or access the same type of information twice. It will be very different for every patient. And that's because primary care sees so many different types of patients. They can go from seeing a perfectly healthy young adult who's just in for a physical or just in for, a yearly checkup or whatever, to a middle schooler, to a elderly person who has a litany of list of different conditions that they're managing and a different problems that they're talking about, to someone who has maybe a pain management, to someone who's coming in for a follow-up from a surgery or a follow-up from an emergency room visit, to somebody who's coming and needs a referral to a specialty. In fact, one of the things that they've found is that primary care physicians often spend the most time out of any practice or any specialty communicating with people outside their own practice, and that's simply because they are kind of the conduit to so many different areas of medicine. And so because of that, there's so much variance in a clinician's system that modern EHRs don't essentially support that type of workflow very well, and they all kind of enforce a specific type of methodology. And so when you talk to clinicians, and this doesn't just apply to primary care, this can apply to any specialty, but every clinician kind of has their own way they like to work. And that's particularly true in primary care, where not only do they have their own way they like to work, but probably more often than not, they don't work the same way twice. And so because of this problem, we have this issue where all these EHRs say, like, you must work exactly this way, you must flow through these screens, and that just adds complexity, that adds problems, and they have to learn it. They have to learn it over and over and over again in order to really feel like they can make the most out of their software. And so one of the things that I, in my research about kind of workflow and software that supports that, I actually stumbled upon this guy named Jason Yuan, who developed this thing called HealthcareOS. And it's a very much a kind of his speculative idea of what an operating system should look like. So not just like a single piece of software, but if you're using a laptop or a computer or whatever, how should someone flow through that? And one of the things, and he has an interesting perspective on this, because he actually says that he designed this specifically with people who are ADHD or people with ADD in mind. And of course, one of the things that they have a hard time with is either focusing or kind of context switching between different tasks and different things. And so he came up with this idea where, basically you kind of create these flows of information. And so he kind of came up with this idea where you kind of have flows pertinent to a particular task, especially, in our everyday life when we might say, hey, I got a text message from someone, that person's asked me if I want to go to lunch. Well, that text or that, that task of, do you want to go to lunch, isn't really just about the text message itself. It's also about choosing a time, choosing a place, figuring out how to get there, figuring out if you have time to go, and then figuring out a place where you both can meet. And so some of that will require your calendar. That'll require, Google search to find places to go. That'll require maybe Google Maps, or a Maps-like system. And that requires a litany of different actual tasks and pieces of software that you have to use. And so his proposal for Mercury specifically is creating this idea of flows that basically react to the information before them. So if you have a flow, a module, your first module might be someone texting you to say, do you want to go to lunch? Your second module might be, oh, well, let's go to, let me look up on my calendar if I can go to lunch. And then it might be, okay, let me, find a list of places that are near me that I can recommend. And those things then feed back into the original text message. And so he came up with this idea where instead of kind of using individual apps, you're actually just flowing through that information kind of universally, agnostically of any one UI, either your browser or your text message or whatever. And even though he developed this kind of more on the side of like people who have ADD, ADHD, ASD, stuff like that, I found a lot of similarity in how a clinician expects to flow through their day-to-day basis, where they are presented with a certain type of piece of information, and then they have to react to that and use and basically flow through other tasks or pieces of information in order to complete that initial task. And not only that, but, especially in the context of a primary care practice, which can be very chaotic, they can be context switching hundreds of times, if not thousands of times per day. I think there's a lot of similarity in how a clinician needs to interact with and see their software, not just in terms of how they're going to flow through those tasks, but really how that software integrates into their day-to-day life. So I've kind of borrowed this idea of these flows with modules, and we're not going to be able to copy it exactly, of course, and that's not the goal, is really to use that as kind of inspiration, particularly for the workflow side of things, where, a clinician has a series of appointments every day, and each of those appointments starts out with roughly the same piece of information, but then depending on what they need to do throughout the day, depending on what that appointment really demands in terms of information or context, they can then pull up additional modules to support that initial information. And then through that process, we can present actions that are kind of universal to each of those modules, so that no matter where they are in that flow, they can always get back to or start or go on to the next task that they need to do. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, let me know, because it's kind of the best way I know to describe it. But basically what I've illustrated here is an item. So we have kind of a sidebar, if you will, here. And we have an item. So say this is an appointment, first appointment of the day, and then we have a series of modules. Now, these modules, we could predefine them for a clinician based on what we think they may need, and certainly there's a possibility of learning from history to say like, hey, you know, this person has this chief complaint. Past chief complaints, you've used these modules, so certainly we could suggest those things, but really we would be starting with one module and then letting the clinician add additional modules as they see fit. And so what this translates to in actuality is when we have our dashboard, we click into our appointments, and we're presented with this kind of sidebar where we have a series of items, these different appointments, and we are presented with kind of a sidebar that has potentially additional actions that someone may need to take. And then they're presented with this initial module, which is, hey, Priscilla or Jerome is coming in. They have this fever. They have these conditions. This was their last appointment. And they can then have either these actions, which begin the encounter, maybe review the chart in more detail or reschedule or something else, or they can then add and open additional modules to look at, or they can create something. So maybe this is probably not super realistic, but maybe they need to send a message to someone based on what Jerome is coming in with. They can do that. And they don't have to send the message to Jerome, though we could certainly suggest that, but maybe it could be sending a message to another person on the care team, or maybe their specialist, if they are coming in as a follow-up. Maybe they send a message to that specialist asking about something that maybe didn't get covered all the way, or maybe they need to create an order. So we're kind of presenting these items to the clinician as they need them. Now, the idea here would be then that they could either save this order or, and they again add these cards out to the right, and don't have it built out here. I'll show you real quick what that might look like. Where, they have their initial card. They could review that card in more detail, or review that chart in more detail, or they can add additional cards out to the side. Here I'm using this plus sign, which would be a context menu, but after some feedback from one of the clinician users that we're talking with, they said, that's just another click, so why not just present me with all the options instead of making me click into it? So that was a good point. But again, part of the idea here is that this then kind of builds out so that they have this kind of whole flow where they can navigate between these cards. And potentially this could be something that they could save in a specific order, or it could be something that they just kind of generate each time based on the patient. Part of the challenge with this, again, is minimizing those number of clicks. So, if we need to, save this out in a particular order, or maybe it even potentially suggests a potential order based on, again, the chief complaint, maybe the conditions, maybe this patient last time, we can kind of learn those things over time. So this is kind of the way that we're kind of envisioning a clinician kind of flowing through this. And again, this is something that we're in the process of testing now. But one of the things that we want to see built out, and this is kind of what we're working on here, is not only how do I add additional cards, how do I interact with those cards, but then how do I flow between these items? This is kind of showing essentially potentially the next upcoming appointment. But if my appointment is now, I begin, where does that take me? Well, here it takes you to the patient note, which we've went over a little bit last week. But then once I'm finished with this, how do I get back to that? How do I kind of get in and out of this quickly? Right now it's a click and it just kind of goes to a new page. But, how might someone flow into that? And specifically, how might you essentially create a new space, this kind of area, this appointments area, from this particular card? And then is it possible to kind of go in and out of these things kind of organically without having to essentially go between lots and lots of pages? It's really just kind of filling the existing space. So this is all things that we're still working through and still working on. And again, this is kind of why I'm, even meeting with these clinicians this week, is to talk about this and talk about the note builder. But you can see that by building this in code, this is really helping us kind of articulate these ideas more clearly, and basically able to kind of help someone see how this is intended to work more completely without really without kind of asking them to kind of imagine, right? Whereas with this Figma file, design file, you kind of have to do a little bit of imagining with this. Whereas here, we're able to kind of really present these things and create some transitions between these items, add these cards out in a row, things like that. So that's it for this week. Again, let me know if you have any questions or thoughts, ideas. I'm always open to that kind of stuff. I hope you enjoy watching these videos. I really like making them. And I guess I will see you all in the next video.